no overt signs particularly of what was likely to happen. I think that the news had been known as the golden coffin for years because people who went to work for the news got paid a lot of money and never left. So you worked there till you died. So a lot of people were very happy at the news, or at least content at the news. When Gannett bought the news, that changed the dynamic and it changed the culture of the newsroom. And I think that's caused a fair amount of unease among the reporting staff. I know a lot of them came to me and said, you know, am I going to have a job? And I said, you'll have a job. It's the executives that will mostly be gone. I said, so as long as you do your job and you do well, you'll still have a job. But it didn't alter the fact that they were uneasy. And with some cause, because Gannett had a reputation for being tough on personnel. They asked me fairly early on, I changed my title from executive editor to chief administrative editor, and then they asked me if I could know how to design buyouts. And I said, sure, I can design buyouts. So I put together what turned out to be a sensational buyout package, and it was offered to employees of every category, and about 50-some people took it. So that started the cultural revolution at the news in terms of Gannett taking over.
Now 50-something out of how many people were?
We had 360.
Okay.
Oh, I think that it was probably part of Frank Vega's orders to come to grips with the union situation in Detroit, and that he knew he would be rewarded handsomely if he managed to best the unions. He came from a union background himself, his family, and he actually bragged about what he was going to do before it ever actually happened. So I think what were the factors? I think the Gannett Corporation was interested in breaking the unions, and secondly, you had a lot of male hormones, male ego, male arrogance working on both sides of the equation, and that exacerbated the situation. So there was not a great deal of likelihood there was going to be a compromise rather than a strike when the negotiations started. Ironically, if they'd waited another 10 or 15 years, they could have broken the unions anyway, because with the revolution in the newspaper business, things have changed anyway. But it dates back. I don't think Vega's predecessor was nearly as aggressive in dealing with the unions. And the unions were foolish. The Teamsters, he went out for drinking beer with the Teamsters when he first got to town. You probably heard the story. At a little bar called the Paperclip or something near the Detroit News North plant. And they drank beer and got to know each other and regaled each other with stories. And then Vega got in his car to leave, and they called the police and said there was a drunk weaving down the highway, and he got pulled over and slapped with a DUI.
That's what it was like.
And Vega, being of Italian origin, did not take well to that. I think he vowed right then that they were going to have an opportunity to regret that little maneuver.
Yeah.
I don't think the effects were that great. There was some amount of increased advertising revenue in the various suburban newspapers, and I think that some people withheld advertising from the News and Free Press. So I'm sure it damaged their total advertising revenue. the plus side in terms of the suburban papers, it might have been 10% or something like that, but it wasn't enough to make you run to the bank with a wheelbarrow full of cash. The suburban papers supposedly were going to gain a lot of circulation. Never happened. Oakland Press actually was probably the most successful of the suburban papers. I can't remember who owned it at that time, whether it was Disney Corporation or Cap Cities or something like that. But in any event, I think their Sunday circulation got up to about 80,000. At the Macomb Daily, I think our peak circulation was in the 50,000 range, 55,000 on Sunday, because we started a Sunday paper out there during that period. And it was successful, so you might say, well, that might have been part of the effect.
So it was starting the Sunday paper, was that a direct kind of response to, because you saw an opportunity?
Not so much to the strike, it was an opportunity because a study of the market said a great deal of the advertising in the market was running in Sunday newspapers. And the Macomb Daily did not have a Sunday paper, so we started it because we felt that we were giving up part of the market, and it proved to be true. I think that their biggest fear was that Detroit historically had been a union town, and I think they were afraid that the population would stand foursquare behind the unions and say, we're not going to read your paper, we're not going to advertise in your paper, you're not going to deliver your paper. That didn't happen. So their biggest fear from management standpoint was probably unresolved. Early on, their biggest problem was they didn't have enough personnel to put out much of a paper. They were using all their editors, and for the first week to 2 weeks, it was a little slipshod. But they got a paper out every day, and that was, to them, a major victory. They were never stopped from publishing. I think that, of course, they were concerned about violence. They brought a lot of security people in. I think that the newspapers played up the violence. The newspapers quickly put out the fact that if you were a jumper on a Teamster truck for the News of the Free Press, which meant your job was to throw the bundles off and pick up the bundles of returns, you were making $65,000 or $70,000 a year. And
that's quite a nice salary for that job.
The public saw that and said, those guys ought to go back to work. They're never going to get a job like that the rest of their lives. And so they didn't sympathize much with the unions. I think that the unions failed to understand the movement away from unionism in the country. And they thought Detroit's special, Detroit's a different market. And the heads of the unions were arrogant, and some of the heads of the unions wanted to go out on strike. And I think that was a huge mistake. I was asked by the unions if I would serve as an advisor to them on the strike. I said I couldn't do that. I was basically a corporate management person, and I couldn't change my stripes that way. But I did tell them, I'll give you one free piece of advice. And they said, what is that? And I said, go back in. Get yourselves back in and work the rule. Because if they'd worked the rule, they wouldn't have got a paper out every day, because everybody would have worked their 7.5, 8 hours, and they'd still have a story in their computer. And they'd say, you want me to work overtime? And they'd say no, and you'd say, okay, and get up and leave. They'd get a paper out maybe every day, but it would not be in the morning. It might be in the afternoon. It might be in the evening. Would have driven them nuts. They were too arrogant to do that. They thought they were going to break the company. And Gannett was well prepared for the strike. I am sure you've read about them having fleets of drivers and fleets of trucks stationed around, ready to go start hauling the papers. So the unions had to know that the company was extremely organized and ready to go to the mat.